Okay. All right. So I've been doing some videos lately, and recently we've been talking about what a time, times, and half a time is for Daniel. In Daniel 7, as you can see in verse 25, he says, and they shall be given into his hand until a time, times, and the dividing of time. And I've answered that question as to what is a time, times, and a dividing of time, or a half time. So just to recap real quick on what that is. So a time, times, and half time. Most people, most preachers will tell you that it's 3.5 years. And I don't believe that it's 3.5 years. I believe that it's something different. I believe that it's an appointed time. And we can dive into the Aramaic, into the Hebrew of what Daniel was referring to, and also into the Greek of what John was referring to in Revelation chapter 12, verse 14. So we can see here, he says, and they shall be given into his hand until a time, times, and the dividing of time. In Daniel 12:7, he says the same thing. He says that it shall be for a time, times, and a half time. And in Revelation 12:14, he says that she is nourished for a time, times, and a half time from the face of the serpent. So we really have to go back into God's word and find out what a time actually is. So if we go to the New Testament and we go to 2 Peter, 2 Peter says, but beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. But that word day shouldn't be there. The better translation, and we can go into it into the Strongs here, the word day, and I'll let the Greek lexicon tell you the word.
Strong's G 2250, hemera. Hemera.
So the word day, okay, is right. It gives you the definition. The day used of a natural day, or the interval between sunrise and sunset, as distinguished from and contrasted with the night. But the word time should be used, not day. The word day shouldn't be used here. It should be a time, because a day, again, to not only the King James writers of the Bible, but also in Paul's time, the word day literally meant burning daylight. That's what day actually means. So if we go back to the verse, the better translation would be, but beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one time is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one time. Okay, now we've got an understanding of what a time is. So one time is 1,000 years, not 1 year, but 1,000 years. Okay. So now we have to really get into the culture, not only of the Jewish culture, but of the culture of Daniel's time and what he's meaning. So just like Jesus used a lot of Jewish idioms, and a good example of an idiom would be, in the English language, would be, they're under the weather. Right? If you go and you tell somebody that in Spanish, they're under the weather, they're going to look at you and confusion, because they don't know what that means. That's an English idiom. So we have to understand their culture and what they're meaning. So when he says, it shall be for a time and times and the dividing of time, well, again, what's the best commentation on the Bible? The Bible. So let's go to Job chapter 33, verse 14. For God speaketh once, yea, twice, yet man perceiveth it not. Well, now the question is, how many times did God speak? Did he speak once, twice, or 3 times? Well, anybody's going to tell you that God spoke twice. He said, for God speaketh once, yea, twice. So he's only spoken twice. He hasn't spoken 3 times. But there's more. Let's go to Job chapter 40, verse 5. Once I have spoken, but I will not answer. Yea, twice, but I will proceed no further. How many times did he speak? Well, he spoke twice. He didn't speak 3 times. And you can find the same in Psalm 62, verse 11. And then there's other times where, God tells you, I've spoken once and I've spoken twice. So how many times did he speak? Did he speak 3 times or did he speak 2 times? Well, he spoke twice. So now that we kind of have an understanding of what the Jewish idiom is, of I've spoken once, I've spoken twice, meaning that they've spoken twice, not 3 times, now we can go back into Daniel and find out what he's actually saying. So it says a time, and we've already established what a time is. A time is 1,000 years. Okay? That's 1 time. Now, when he says times, is he meaning 2 times? Or when you add it up, is it 3 times? Or is it only 2 times? Well, I'm going to say that it's only 2 times. So it's a time, times, and a half time. So if it's only 2 times, and we know a time is 1,000 years, then we know that a time, times, and half a time would have to equal 2,500 years. But can we prove that? Well, sure. Let's go into it. Let's go to the beginning of the chapter in Daniel chapter 7. He says, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. Okay. Well, let's go to his first year. His first year was in 553 BC. Okay. So, and some of y'all are asking and thinking, well, what does that mean? Well, that's the time frame. Daniel tells you that he's getting this vision in the first year of King Belshazzar. And then he tells you that, and they shall be given into his hand until a time, times, and the dividing of time. So it really should read, and they shall be given into his hand until 2,500 years. Well, do the math. I can do it for you. We can do it here. Let's do it here for you. It's not showing you, I don't think. But let's see. Okay, it is showing it for you. Okay, so 5,300 BC. So we'll start out with negative because it goes from negative to positive, right? Negative 553 BC, and you add 2,500 years. Well, you get the year 1947. But that's technically not the right answer. And the reason it's not the right answer is because you have to remember that there was no year 0. So you have to add 1. You get 1948. And we know what happened in 1948. On May 14th, 1948, Israel became a nation just as the prophets predicted, just as Daniel predicted, just as Ezekiel and Isaiah and Jeremiah and Amos and Joel, they all predicted that Israel would become a nation once more. And Daniel actually gives you the time frame. He gives you how many years? 1948. But there's more proof. That could be a coincidence, right? Well, let us go to Daniel 12. So you have to understand that in Daniel 12, when Daniel was writing this, there was no chapters, right? There was no Daniel 11, Daniel 12, Daniel 10. So we have to understand when he wrote this. And he wrote it in King Cyrus's 3rd year in reign, in his power. Okay? That would be 534 BC. Okay? And he tells you, let's read the whole verse. Then I heard the one man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and half a time, and when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all these things shall be finished. So Daniel's telling you, and everybody will tell you, oh, well, this is for the time of the tribulation. This is for the, let me tell you something, folks, and we can dive into it deeper later, but you're in the tribulation. You've been in the tribulation for almost 1,300 years. You're telling me that World War I, World War II, and all the wars afterwards have not been the worst in human history? And everybody says, well, yeah, but I mean, the Christians, they have to suffer. The Christians have suffered. Hundreds of millions of Christians have been murdered for Jesus Christ's name. You're in the tribulation. And a lot of people will tell you, oh, well, it's got to be a 7-year period. No, it doesn't. Where does it say that? You find me a Bible verse where it says it's a 7-year tribulation. You can't. Everybody only says that it's a 7-year tribulation because they believe the sci-fi biblical stories that they've been given. There is no 7-year tribulation. You're in it. And Jesus tells you when it's going to happen. He says, once the abomination of desolation is standing where it ought not, as spoken by the prophet Daniel, then you'll know. But remember that Daniel is a sealed book. People were not supposed to know the secrets of the book of Daniel. Not even Daniel knew the secrets of the book of Daniel. He was just told to write them. But now we can understand them. Now we can see them. But let's do some reading here. And at that time, Michael shall stand up, and the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. Well, I agree. I think we're in troublous times. We have been for many, many generations. And at that time, your people shall be delivered. So what is he telling them? Your people, Daniel's people, the Jewish people, will be delivered. Well, have they been delivered? I'd argue yes, they have been delivered. Everyone who is found written in the book, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to everlasting contempt. Now again, not all of this is complete, right? There are still things that need to happen. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteousness, but like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. And a lot of people will tell you, oh, well, this is technology, this is AI, that's not what it's referring to here. What it's referring to is that during the time of the end, people will know that it's the time of the end. It's that simple. That's what he was saying. Then I, Daniel, looked, and there stood 2 others, one on this riverbank and the other on that riverbank. And one said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, how long shall the fulfillment of these wonders be? So he's not asking how long until the end times. He's asking how long until this is fulfilled. How long until the Jewish people are no longer trampled upon? And he answers, then I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, when he held his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and half a time. And when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all these things shall be finished. Okay. So again, time times and half a time is 2,500 years. And now we have a starting point, which is King Cyrus's third year in power. That was 534 BC. So we can do the math for you. 534 BC plus 2,500 years. And again, you have to add that 1 year because there was no year zero. You get 1967. And some of us, not myself, but some people still remember the 6-Day War when Israel, for the first time in 2,500 years, took control of the holy city of Jerusalem. Folks, God's timeline is here. He tells us what his timeline is. He gives it to us. He wants us to understand it. He wants us to know it. And if you go to Luke chapter 21, verse 24, Jesus talks about the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Well, in 1967, the time of the Gentile was fulfilled. 1967 is when the Jews finally took control of Jerusalem. So now that we have an understanding of what time, times, and half a time is, we can start understanding other things, such as the Abomination of Desolation. In reality, I probably should go over the 70 weeks of Daniel, and the 70 weeks of Daniel has already been fulfilled. A lot of people will tell you, well, it's only the 69 weeks, and then there's that extra, week, and that's for the Antichrist, and, Israel is going to build up this temple, and they're going to be able to sacrifice again, and no. Go back to Daniel. He will tell you the 70 weeks of Daniel in Daniel chapter 9 have been fulfilled. He tells you that the 70 weeks are not for the Antichrist, they're for the Messiah. The Messiah already fulfilled it. The 69 weeks only gives you to the time of Christ's birth. Then at the 7 weeks, or the last of the seven, or the last week, is the baptism of Christ, and 3.5 later, he is cut off, just as the prophet Daniel said he would be. He is crucified and killed, okay? And guess what? He causes the sacrifice to cease. He's the one that ends the sacrifice. Not anybody else. Not some mythical Antichrist. It was Jesus. Jesus ended the sacrifice. Why do you think we don't sacrifice anymore? Because he's the one that ends the sacrifice. So when we understand that, then we can understand the rest. Well, it's not just 3.5 weeks, or 3.5, because there's a day to year prophecy, right? So you have the week. In the midst of the week, he shall cut off the sacrifice. Well, that's what Jesus did when he died. Well, what about the remaining 3.5 days in that week? Well, 3.5 years after the death of Christ, Stephen is stoned and killed. And it's no longer, the covenant was with the Jewish people. It's no longer to the Jewish people at that point. It's also to the Gentiles. Because 3.5 years after the death of Christ, Paul starts his ministry to the Gentiles. 70 weeks of Daniel have been fulfilled. And once you understand that, then you can understand the time, times, and half time. Understand that Daniel was prophesying the return to the exact year of Israel, to the exact year that Israel would regain Jerusalem. But now we have to understand other things here. There are other things that we must understand. Let's continue in Daniel chapter 12. Before I go to Revelation chapter 12, verse 14, where John is talking about, and we can go there real quick. I won't really get too deep into it just yet, But he says, and the woman and to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the face of the serpent. Well, we know in Revelation chapter 12, it's talking about how Israel gave birth to the man-child, which is Jesus the Messiah, and she's kicked out. She's in the wilderness for 2,500 years. We'll get into that here in a little while, but I will tell you that that does have to do with the United States of America, and I can prove it mathematically and through Scripture. But first, let's continue with Daniel. Let's understand. Let's talk about the abomination of desolation. Everybody always says, oh, it's a future thing when you see the abomination of desolation. Well, the abomination of desolation has been here, folks. It's been here since 688 AD, and Daniel prophesied that. And so did Jesus. You go to Matthew chapter 4, Jesus talks about the abomination of desolation. But he also talks about other things too. He talks about false Christ and false prophets. I mean, who is he really referring to there in Matthew chapter 24? I think that he's referring to somebody specific. I mean, we can go to it if you'd like. Thank you, President Putin, for the follow. Let's see. We'll go to Matthew. Matthew 24. And we can read up on it. So Jesus tells them, so he right here in 15, he tells you, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. And I can contend and I can bet you that it will be on the Sabbath day, and it will be in the winter. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. He's giving you a time frame. When the abomination of desolation is there, the tribulation begins. And I've already given you the year. The year was 688 AD. And it was something that they built on the Temple Mount, on the Holy of Holies. It's been there. You've been in the tribulation. You were born into it. And except those days should be shortened, there should be no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. So for those of us who believe, we shall be saved. Then if any man shall say unto you, lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. So he's talking about somebody specific here. For there shall arise false Christ and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. So just reread that. For there shall arise false Christ. There have been false Christ many times. And false prophets, there's many of those. But I contend that he's talking about somebody specific here. And show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. I believe that that's already happened. Behold, I have told you before. Wherefore, if they shall say unto you, behold, he is in the desert, and that's an indication. Thoughts? So, speaking of false prophets, your thoughts on inmate number? I'm sorry, I don't know who that is. You'd have to enlighten me. But again, I'm telling you that he's speaking of somebody specific here. He says, wherefore, if they shall say unto you, behold, he is in the desert. In the desert. Go not forth, behold, he is in the secret chambers, believe it or not. Believe it not. So he's telling you where this false Christ is going to be. This false Christ, this false prophet, he tells you where he's going to be. He's going to be in the desert. Well, who is in the desert? Well, we can get to that here in just a moment. But Jesus tells you, for as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. So all these Christian, scientific, sci-fi, Hollywood propaganda that they're feeding Christians and telling Christians, oh, it's going to be just like the Left Behind series. There's going to be a secret rapture. There's going to be a secret coming. That doesn't sound very secret. Lightning shining from one side of the globe to the other is not a secret, folks. It's not a secret. That's something that's going to be very loud. And we can get into it later. But Luke and Matthew both talk about it. And we can go into the original Greek. And Luke gives one type of description and Matthew gives another type of description. But both of them give one description. They're not giving two separate descriptions. It's one description. And to really sum it up, it would be a very loud and fiery entrance of the Messiah. That's what it would be. But going back to behold, he is in the desert. Personally, I believe he's talking about Muhammad. Muhammad was in the desert. He was a false prophet. Not only was he a false prophet, he was a false Messiah. He claimed that Christ served him, that he was the one to follow and not Christ. And he deceived the very elect. And shortly after his death in 688 AD, they erected the Abomination of Desolation. And not only can I prove that to you scripturally, I can also prove that to you mathematically on God's timeline. I mean, you go to Daniel chapter 12 here, and he tells you, he says, and from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away, so he's not telling you that, oh, the daily sacrifice has to be taken away, then the Abomination of Desolation set up, and they got to happen right after the other. He didn't say that. He's giving you a timeline. He says, when the daily sacrifice is taken away, then the Abomination of Desolation is set up. There shall be 1,290 days. He's giving you a time frame. He's giving you a time frame. That's what he does. He gives you a time frame. He has given you that time frame. So from, let's see. I think it was, I'm trying to find the year real quick and we can go to it. So yeah, I think that would be the year. Okay. So in 603 BC, right? 603 BC, the Jewish people are taken into captivity And it was the remaining Jews that were taken into captivity by the Babylonians. Okay? You take 603 BC, and you add your 1,290 days, because remember, a day is a year. A day for a year of prophecy. Go back to Ezekiel chapter 4. He tells you that. And again, you got to add that 1 year, because there's no year zero. You get 688 AD. He tells you when the abomination of desolation will be there. He tells you exactly when the abomination of desolation is there. Exactly. He tells you to a T when the abomination of desolation will be there. And the abomination of desolation, if some of you haven't already figured out, is the Dome of the Rock and its twin brother, Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, the Dome of the Rock is not a mosque. The Dome of the Rock is a shrine to Muhammad during his night ride into heaven. And don't believe me that it's not Antichrist? Well, let's go to John. Let's go to 1 John chapter 2, verse 22. What does he say? He says, "Who is a liar but he that denieth that Jesus is the Christ?" He is Antichrist. And it's kind of funny because everybody says, oh, well, Antichrist is somebody who denies Christ. Well, I contend it's somebody who denies the Father and the Son. Someone who denies not just the Son, but the Father. And in Islam, you do not call Allah Father. That's a disgrace. That's a no-no. You don't do that. Allah is not your father. You are his slave. So he says, he is Antichrist that denieth the Father and the Son. And on the side of the Dome of the Rock, it says plainly, Allah has no son. Right there, on the Temple Mount, on the Holy of Holies. And it was built in 688 AD, and I showed you the math on God's timeline that God said it would be there in 688 AD. And going back to what Jesus said, what did he tell you? He said, "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let him which be in Judea flee into the mountains." Well, that's what happened. That's what happened when Judea was overtaken by Islam in 636 AD, and then they came in and they started to rebuild and do all these things, and they caused problems. They killed a lot of Christians and a lot of Jewish people. And guess when they did it? In the wintertime, just as Jesus said, "Pray ye that it's not in the winter." It was a siege on Jerusalem. And God told us when it would be. And I know that it can be a lot to take in. It's kind of like a fire hydrant. There's a lot that can be talked about. But we have to understand one thing. The timeline has been given. And when I tell people about the timeline, the number one question that I always get is, well, when is Jesus returning? I don't know. And I think if anybody says that they know, be cautious. Be very cautious about that one. What I can tell you is I think that it will be within the decade. And the reason I think that it would be within the decade is because the parable of the fig tree. When you see the leaves blossom, know that summer is nigh, right? Even at the door. But he says, and this generation shall not pass away. Well, the time of the Gentiles has been fulfilled in 1967. The fig tree is blossomed. It's there. You see the leaves. You see everything. You've got one generation. So that's my opinion on the return of Christ, based on the fig tree. Now, going into Revelation 12:14, we know that a time, times, and a half time is 2,500 years. Well, we got to find out here when the time period or when the timetable starts for this time, times, and half a time here in Revelation. God doesn't change his stuff unless he says he changes it, right? For example, you go into Revelation chapter 11 and talking about the two witnesses, and I feel that the majority of the church and the majority of believers got that completely wrong too. And don't get me wrong, I'm not sitting here pointing fingers and making fun of anybody because I've been sucked into it as well. But when it says the candlestick, well, I mean, if you go to Jeremiah and you go to Isaiah, you know what the candlestick is, right? Well, it doesn't represent the same thing. So you have to go where God changed that symbol. But God didn't change time, times, and half time. Nowhere did he change it. It's been 2,500 years since the time of Daniel, and it's 2,500 years in the book of Revelation, written by John. So we know that this chapter is talking about Israel, right? Let's kind of dive into that. So Israel and Judea were divided into two kingdoms, right? A southern kingdom and a northern kingdom, right? Well, the northern kingdom actually fell almost 200 years before Judea fell to the Babylonians. So Judea goes to the Babylonians. Well, the northern part of Israel, well, they go to the Assyrians, and they get attacked in 745 BC. And the difference between the northern part of Israel and the southern part of Judea is that after the captivity in Babylon, the Jews returned back to Judea. The northern part of Israel, the 10 tribes never returned. They never went back. So where did they go? Well, that's the question. That's the million-dollar question. Where did they go? Well, I contend that they went east and that mainly they went west. I mean, if you look at where Assyria is on the map, ancient Assyria, and you look at where they all went, it would have been into the Caucasus Mountains. They would have went up into the Anatolia farmer area, and then they would have went up into western and eastern parts of Europe, mainly Western Europe. And there's also other few things that we can touch base on and talk about later about why I actually believe that, because there is evidence to suggest that. Because we know where Satan goes. Satan goes where God's people are. It's where he's always gone. That's who he's always gone after. And that kind of also answers the last question in Daniel of the 1,335 days. Is he talking about an additional 1,335 days? I don't think so. I think he's talking about an additional 45 days. But we can talk about that later. Right now, let's focus on Revelation 12:14. So we know that this chapter is talking about how, let's just read it. Let's just read it. Don't take my word for it. Read it. The woman Israel. And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, travailing in birth, and pain to be delivered. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven. So when he's referring to stars here, he's referring to angels. And did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. And she brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. So the child is Jesus Christ. And the woman fled into the wilderness. She fled into the desert, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. Now, we'll get into that later, what that means. Okay? What that means. Actually, we can get into that now. That's a very simple one. 688, remember the Abomination of Desolation. She's kicked out, right? Well, she comes back for the 1,260 days. So 688 plus the 1260, 1948. See, we don't got to do the add 1 year because this isn't BC to AD. So she came back again, just like it said, right? And they should feed her there 1,260 days. So from the time of the Abomination of Desolation, when they're kicked out again from Israel, from Jerusalem, you have 1,260 years until they come back, 1948. And of course, he talks about, so there's a war in heaven, it's Satan, going over that. And then we get to, and to the woman, which is Israel, were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the face of the serpent. So, we have to find out when that time begins. Well, ancient Israel was kicked out of their home. Finally, the siege of the capital city, Samaria, of Israel, happened in 724 BC. Well, you add 2,500 years, and again, you don't have to add the additional year, because this is written in AD time. So it's already accounted for. You get 1776. And like I said, the northern part of Israel moved west to Western Europe and eventually became part of the United States. And I actually have a different timeline that adds up to 1776 from BC to AD. We can talk about that one real quick. Let's touch base on that real quick if you don't believe me here. Well, northern Israel disobeyed God. And in Leviticus chapter 26, God said, if you do not follow me, if you do not listen, if you disobey me and walk contrary to my word, I will punish you 7 times. Now, what was the 7 times? What is he multiplying that by? He's multiplying that by a year, a 360-day year. That's what he's punishing them by. So you take 7 and you multiply it by 360, you get 2,520 years. That's what God told them. I will punish you 7 times. Well, let's take the... Give me just a moment here. Okay, let's see. Okay, so in the year 745 BC, northern Israel is sacked by Assyria. It lasted quite some time. So in 745, this is when their punishment begins. Okay, this is when their captivity and their punishment begins. You add 2,500 years. Whoop, doing that all wrong. 745 plus 2,520 years for their punishment, you get 1775. But again, because it's BC to AD, you got to add that 1 year. America is in biblical prophecy. I don't care what any preacher or what any pastor or what anybody tells you. America is in biblical prophecy. You can find them in Micah chapter 5, verse 5. You can find them in Ezekiel and in Isaiah. You can find them in Psalms. They are there. They've been there. But nobody wants to acknowledge it. Nobody wants to acknowledge that the United States has sent out more missionaries than any other nation in world history. Nobody wants to acknowledge that the United States was founded on Judeo-Christian values. And I'll go more into this later. But it describes America as being a battle axe. It describes America as being a warrior-like tribe. There's a lot that we could go into for this. There's a lot that we could go into with this, and I will eventually get there. But right now, I'm kind of trying to establish timelines so people understand that, yes, God did give us timelines. That God did want us to know His plan. And that if we study His Word and know His Word, we can understand His Word and His timelines that He has established. So yes, America was and is in Bible prophecy. America was the first nation to recognize Israel as a state. America has been there for Israel since the beginning. Granted, I'm not saying America's perfect. I'm not saying that we're great all the time, all day, every day. But we have done things that other nations absolutely envy. And it says it. And I'll give you a little hint of who I think we are. I think we're the tribe of Ephraim. He is the battle axe. He is the warrior tribe. It says Ephraim will not envy Israel. I mean, come on. Look at what it said in Genesis chapter 48. The prophecy on Ephraim. That he will be a multitude of nations. And that he would be a multitude, an uncountable number of people. Folks, you got to read the word. You got to understand the timelines and what God is actually talking about and what He's referring to anytime He talks. Because He's given it all to us. He's laid it all out. Everything. Every single thing He has given us. But I guess that's going to be it for tonight. If y'all want to know more, please let me know in the comments. We can talk more. If you got questions, I'll answer them. But y'all go and read y'all's word and understand that Christ's return is